The lights of the Wilson Report studio burned brightly, reflecting off the sleek, modern set. The air was charged with anticipation as millions of Americans tuned in for what was promised to be a provocative, unfiltered conversation. Before we get into the details, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from. Mark Wilson adjusted his tie, his trademark smirk in place as he glanced at his producers. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His show thrived on controversy, and tonight, he had the perfect guest, Melania Trump. He wasn't planning to let her off easy. The former First Lady sat opposite him, poised and elegant as ever. A small golden crucifix glinted just above the neckline of her dress, catching the light with every breath she took. It was subtle, yet powerful, a silent declaration of faith. And Mark was about to make it a problem. "So, Mrs. Trump," he began smoothly, leaning forward, "you've been a public figure for years, and I have to ask, do you think it's appropriate to wear such an overt religious symbol when representing a country as diverse as ours?" The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. Some nodded in agreement, others waited, curious to see how she would respond. Melania met his gaze without hesitation. "Why wouldn't it be?" Mark let out a light chuckle, shaking his head as if the answer was obvious. "Well, as a public figure, don't you think it's important to remain neutral? To make sure everyone feels included?" Melania tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Mark, you host a show where you express your opinions every night. Should I ask you to remain neutral as well?" A few gasps rippled through the audience. Mark's smirk faltered for just a second. "That's different," he countered. "I'm a journalist. You were the First Lady. You represent more than just yourself." Melania nodded slowly, then lifted her crucifix between two fingers, holding it delicately. "And this," she said, her voice calm but firm, "represents more than just me." Silence filled the studio. Mark leaned back, clearly irritated that the conversation wasn't going the way he had intended. "Look, I'm just saying, what if someone of another faith saw that and felt excluded?" Melania let the crucifix rest against her chest again. "Are you asking me to hide my faith to make others comfortable?" The audience was now entirely locked in. Mark cleared his throat. "I'm asking whether you think it's responsible to display something so divisive." Melania gave him a small, knowing smile. "Faith is not divisive, Mark. But telling people to hide who they are? That is." A slow clap started somewhere in the audience. Mark's jaw tightened. He was losing control. He had expected her to stumble, to hesitate, to defend herself. Instead, she was turning the tables, making him the one who seemed intolerant. Desperate to regain the upper hand, he scoffed. "But don't you think as a public figure, you have a duty to—" "Duty to whom?" Melania interrupted, her voice still composed, but carrying a new edge. "To those who believe as I do? Or to those who think I should pretend I don't?" Mark had no response. Melania leaned forward slightly. "You say this is about inclusion. But true inclusion means respecting people as they are, not asking them to hide their beliefs to fit someone else's idea of neutrality." The audience erupted into applause. Mark's face paled. This was not the way it was supposed to go. But the damage was done. The shift in energy was unmistakable. People in the audience were nodding, whispering to each other. Social media was already lighting up with clips of the exchange. And Mark Wilson, the king of late-night takedowns, had just been taken down himself. The second the cameras cut, Mark ripped off his earpiece, his face tight with frustration. His producers were already scrambling. "Phones are blowing up," one muttered, glancing at a buzzing control board. Mark barely heard him. He stormed off the set, straight into his dressing room, slamming the door behind him. He grabbed his phone. Social media was on fire. Melania just dismantled Mark Wilson on live TV. He tried to shame her, and she made him look like a fool. How is it that Mark thinks inclusion means silencing faith? Mark's stomach twisted. He had been in controversial debates before, but this was different. He wasn't just losing the argument. He was losing control of the narrative. And in his world, that was the kiss of death. His assistant knocked. "Mark, the network wants a meeting. Now." He clenched his jaw. He already knew what was coming. The conference room was ice cold. The network executives sat in silence as Mark tried to justify himself. I was just pushing back. It's my job to challenge guests. The head executive, a steely-eyed woman in her 50s, leaned forward. And yet, you were the one who ended up being challenged. Mark gritted his teeth. I didn't do anything wrong. She slid a phone across the table. The screen displayed a poll. Who won the debate? Melania Trump, 89%. Mark Wilson, 11%. His stomach dropped. The executive sighed. Sponsors are nervous. The network is nervous. You have two options, apologize or take a break from the show. Mark's blood boiled. Apologize? To her? But as he stared at the poll numbers, he knew the truth. Melania Trump had just done what no one else had ever managed. She had beaten him, and she hadn't even needed to try. Mark Wilson sat in his office, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he couldn't bring himself to type the words his network was demanding. An apology. His inbox was flooded. Sponsors reconsidering their contracts, the network pressuring him to make a public statement. Meanwhile, online, the storm was only growing. Hashtag Mark Wilson Exposed was trending. Videos of the interview had been dissected from every angle. Some conservative commentators called it a defining moment in the culture war. Even liberal viewers weren't defending him. Many saw his push against Melania's cross as an overreach, an unnecessary attack. Mark scrolled through the comments. He tried to shame her, but he got schooled on live TV. Imagine claiming to support tolerance while demanding someone hide their faith. This might be the end of the Wilson report. His heart pounded. He had built his career on sharp wit, aggressive questioning, never backing down. And now, they wanted him to kneel? A soft knock on his office door. His assistant, Sophie, stepped inside. They're expecting a statement by noon, she said carefully. Mark sighed. Do you think I should apologize? Sophie hesitated, then shrugged. Depends. Do you actually feel sorry? Mark scowled. That's not the point. Isn't it? She asked, crossing her arms. Because if you don't mean it, they'll know. And if you do mean it, maybe you should think about why. Her words lingered after she left. He tapped his fingers against his desk, staring at the blinking cursor. Apologizing wasn't just about saving his job. It would mean admitting he had been wrong. And Mark Wilson did not like being wrong. Meanwhile, Melania Trump's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her team had expected some level of media attention after the interview. But this? It was overwhelming. Calls from journalists, faith leaders, even celebrities, some offering support, others asking for interviews. She declined them all. She had said what needed to be said. Nothing more. But what she hadn't expected was the flood of messages from everyday Americans. A woman from Ohio wrote, I stopped wearing my cross to work because I was afraid of being judged. After watching you, I'm putting it back on. A young girl from Texas. I'm 16, and people make fun of me for praying at school. Thank you for showing me I don't have to hide. Melania scrolled through them, her heart tightening. She had gone on the Wilson report expecting hostility, but she hadn't realized how many people felt the pressure to shrink their beliefs to fit a world that demanded neutrality. This was bigger than an interview. It was a moment. And moments like this? They didn't just fade away. She picked up the phone and made a call. It's time we do something. The fallout from the interview didn't die down. It escalated. Mark Wilson's network was feeling the heat. Advertisers were pulling out. Audience numbers had plummeted. And then, the final blow. The Wilson report was being put on temporary hiatus. The words hit Mark like a sledgehammer. This is my show, he growled at his boss during a private call. Not anymore, came the response. Mark sat in stunned silence after hanging up. It was over. Not just a bad week. Not just a hit to his reputation. His career, the empire he had built, was collapsing. And all because of one woman and her cross. But what Mark didn't realize yet, his story wasn't over. Not even close. Because what happened next would change everything. Mark Wilson disappeared. Not literally. He still existed, of course. But the Mark Wilson who commanded late-night television, who dominated headlines, who dictated the national conversation, that Mark Wilson was gone. His show was on an indefinite hiatus. The network had quietly removed his name from their website. Invitations to major events dried up. Even his usual friends in the industry stopped returning his calls. And worst of all, the world had moved on. He had been the Mark Wilson. Now, he was just another cautionary tale. Sitting in the corner of a dimly lit bar in New York, he scrolled through his phone. Every story, every headline, every conversation on social media still revolved around her. Melania Trump sparks national movement on faith and free expression. Former First Lady stands firm, ignites cultural shift. How one interview changed the conversation about personal belief in America. Mark clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about losing his job. This was about losing control of the narrative. And that was unacceptable. He needed a way back in. But there was only one move left to make. The next morning, Mark sat at his desk, staring at his phone. He had drafted, deleted, and retyped the message at least a dozen times. Finally, with a deep breath, he typed out 3 words. Let's talk. In person. And then he hit send. To Melania Trump. Melania's team wasn't thrilled. You don't owe him anything, one advisor told her. He just wants to use this to fix his reputation, another warned. But Melania wasn't worried about Mark Wilson's intentions. She was thinking about something else. The why behind all of this. Why had her quiet act of faith become such a lightning rod? Why had so many people written to her, thanking her for not backing down? This was about more than just one television interview. This was about the pressure so many felt, to hide, to conform, to make themselves smaller. She thought about the teenage girl who had messaged her, afraid to pray at school. The elderly woman who had written that she'd been told to take her cross necklace off at work. The young father who had said he was teaching his kids to stay quiet about their faith so they wouldn't be targeted. This was not about Mark Wilson. This was about something much, much bigger. And so, against her team's advice, she agreed. I'll meet with him. Mark walked into the private restaurant in D.C., nervous but masking it well. Melania was already there, waiting, calm, as if she had already won before he had even sat down. Mark, she said, her tone polite but unreadable. He forced a smile. Melania. They sat. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Mark sighed and leaned forward. Look, I'll be honest. That interview wrecked my career. Melania studied him. Did it? Mark frowned. What do you mean? She tilted her head slightly. Did the interview ruin you? Or did you ruin yourself? His jaw tightened. I was doing my job. Were you? She asked, her voice still calm. Or were you just trying to control the conversation? Mark opened his mouth to respond, but then stopped. Because for the first time in his life, he had no answer. Melania folded her hands in front of her. I did not come here to argue. You wanted to talk. So talk. Mark exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I need to understand, he admitted. Why did you become such a symbol? Melania didn't hesitate. Because people are tired. Mark raised an eyebrow. Tired of what? Tired of being told they have to hide who they are, she said simply. Tired of being shamed for what they believe. Tired of being managed by people who think they know better. Mark swallowed. That stung more than he wanted to admit. She leaned in slightly. You thought you could push me into a corner. You thought I would back down. But I didn't. And now people see they don't have to either. Mark's mind was spinning. He had walked in expecting a battle, a chance to negotiate, maybe even to find a way back into the public's good graces. But instead, Melania Trump was giving him something else. Truth. Unfiltered, undeniable truth. And for the first time in his life, he was listening. Melania didn't expect Mark Wilson to change overnight. But something was different when he left that meeting. Something in his eyes. For weeks, he stayed silent. No public statements, no attempts to regain control of the narrative. And then, one day, out of nowhere, he released a video. No production, no flashy edits. Just him, sitting alone in his apartment. People have been asking where I've been, he said. And I've been asking myself the same thing. A pause. I built my career on pushing back, on questioning, on challenging others. But somewhere along the way, I stopped questioning myself. He exhaled. I thought I was fighting for what was right. But what I was really doing was deciding for people what they were allowed to believe, what they were allowed to express. And I was wrong. The video was under 3 minutes, but it changed everything. Within hours, the video had millions of views. Some people called it fake. Some mocked it. But others felt it. And the conversation that had started with Melania Trump standing her ground was now something else entirely. It was no longer about just one woman, one interview, one viral moment. It was about people realizing they could stand their ground, that they didn't have to shrink themselves to fit into a mold someone else had made. And Mark Wilson? Well, his redemption didn't happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he was on the right path. Not because he had been forced to be, but because he had finally started to see. And that was something no one could take away from him. Have you ever been put in an awkward position? How did you react to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss if this story resonated with you. Support the channel, like, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss new releases. Let's talk together about things that really matter.